But tonight we're going to turn it over to Dr. Banta to talk about our stocking rates and hay needs.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So when we think about forage needs for a cow-calf operation, the first thing I kind of want to talk about just a little bit is what's the goal of our forage plan or our forage system, because that's ultimately what our forage needs are feeding into. And then we'll talk about what things we can impact, what would be some reasonable stocking rates depending on sizes of cows and amount of forage you produce. And then we'll talk about calculating hay needs later on. So when I think about the goal of a forage system or a forage plan, what I'm really trying to do is maximize the number of days I can graze those cattle. But not only graze those cattle where I don't need very much or no supplementation at all other than a mineral vitamin supplement. I want to make sure we're achieving good weaning rates. And so we want to at least be 85% or better, hopefully, would be our target. And then we want to make sure we have good weaning weights as well. And all those things directly go into our forage system. And the thing that we can have the biggest impact on is going to be the stocking rates of that system. And so when we think about a forage system, we think about customizing that to your operation, your soil type, and your resources. And so everybody's going to be a little bit different. And that's why while we may have some general guidelines from a stocking rate standpoint, we definitely do see some variation. So when we think about the management factors that can affect the amount of forage we produce, the two that we have the biggest impact on is going to be whether we put fertilizer out or not. And specifically when we're thinking about Bermuda grass, we're thinking about nitrogen and potassium are going to be the two big ones there. Bahia grass, a limited amount of nitrogen, it's just not going to respond quite as well. So we have to keep in mind the response potential of the forage we're using, but we got to have that fertilizer out there in most of those environments, and more or less fertilizer depending on our stocking rates. And I realize fertilizer is up this year when we look at cost of nitrogen. When I priced it a couple of weeks ago for application for a family operation, it was about 35% higher than it was last year. But we still have to plan on putting that fertilizer out unless we're going to reduce those cow numbers. Otherwise, we're going to get them to a bigger bind in the long run. And really all that kind of boils back down to grazing pressure and stocking rate. So how hard are we grazing that forage? And the biggest thing we can do to impact that is our stocking rates. So some of you have seen these slides before. I really like the next couple of pictures I'm going to show here because I think they really illustrate this concept well of grazing pressure and what that means to your operation. And so if we look at this picture here, I'm going to tell you I took this picture August 4th of 2011. So not trying to bring up bad memories, but obviously we were in a pretty severe drought that year. There's people west of us here, especially when we get into a few parts of Texas, but when we get into New Mexico, Arizona, and then North Central Plains, North Dakota is really dry right now. And that we can get into those dry times, but I want you to look at this picture here. It's taken on August 4th. This next picture was taken on the same day, August 4th, and you see a tremendous amount of difference in how much forage we have available to those animals. Really, there shouldn't be any cows left on this piece of property. They should have been moved off of that property, or if they were going to use this as a sacrifice pasture, should have had some feed and some other supplements out there. So not the kind of management we're looking for here. But the thing I want you to take away from these three pictures here is that first picture was on the north side of the road. The second picture was on the south side of the road. And I know a lot of times we like to think the rain cloud stopped at our fence line or property line, but in reality, these two properties probably got the same amount of rain. So why such a big difference in forage production there? It goes back to what were they doing from a fertilizer and weed control standpoint, and then more importantly, what were they doing from a stocking rate standpoint, and were they stocked appropriately? Were they overstocked, or maybe were they stocked a little more conservatively to be ready in case they got a little dry? And obviously that first picture there, we looked at where they had a little bit more forage and even managed to cut a little bit of hay in the background. They were much more conservative there. When we think about forage production and we think about the impact our stocking rates have on it, is we really want to think about stubble height. The shorter we graze those pastures, the less root mass we're going to have. The less root mass we're going to have, the less robust that plant's going to be, the less able it's going to be to explore greater soil mass when we get dry or to search out for additional plant nutrients, and less overall forage production we're going to have there. So we're definitely looking for more root mass, and we got to have more stubble height to get that root mass there. So if we look at this picture here in a pasture that's severely overgrazed, just kind of imagine how little root mass we're going to have under those plants and why it's going to take so much longer to recover in that situation. Look at this pasture here, and we have a little bit more cover, but again, still way too short. We'd expect to have a little bit more root mass, but really not what we're looking for yet. And look at this situation. This is kind of more of the minimum we're looking for. So when we're thinking about Bermuda grass, really want to keep at least 3 to 4 inches of stubble height out there. And even from a hay standpoint, when you cut hay, if you'll keep a little bit more stubble in those fields and not scalp them quite as low, they'll actually come back quicker and you'll get regrowth and ultimately more pounds of hay produced off that hay field during the year. So a more appropriate stubble height, we're thinking about quite a bit more root mass there. And then definitely when we got even more stubble height, we're thinking about more root mass. And that's just going to benefit us in the long run from how much forage we produce, allowing those cows to be more selective so they can just consume the higher quality portion of those plants. So they're going to stay in better condition. The cows are going to milk a little heavier, which is going to help weaning weights. And then also when we think about those calves and the grass they're consuming, now they're consuming higher quality forage, which is going to help weaning weights as well. Now, when we think about stocking rate, it's not a fixed deal. It's a moving target depending on what the weather conditions are, what we're getting from a rainfall standpoint and those kind of things. And even in the spring, are we having a cooler spring or did it warm up a little sooner? And how does that affect your forage? If you have some ryegrass out there, the cooler spring doesn't hurt you any. If you don't have any ryegrass and you're just waiting on that Bermuda grass or that Bahia grass, now we're having to feed hay longer. And so that's going to adjust what we're going to have to do and what our stocking rates are going to need to be. So the big question everybody has is how many acres do you need per cow? And hopefully by now you kind of have got a pretty good feeling that it's not a set number. It's going to depend on the situation and it's going to vary year from year, but we can look at how weight of those cows affects that and what would be kind of some reasonable guidelines for most of East Texas and Central Texas. And then obviously we need to think about our soil type as well. So if we remember back to the presentation we did on using the web soil survey, this is something we talked about there, and that is on the YouTube channel if you want to go back and look at that as a refresher. But if we look here, this soil type that's in the kind of dark blue here, highest yielding potential on the place. If we look at the red, really low yielding potential and not quite half, but considerably less there, depending on whether we have more of that high producing soil or more of that low producing soil or that soil that has that potential to produce more or less is going to impact those stocking rates as well. So when we think about stocking rates, and then we'll also use this when we're thinking about hay needs later on, is when we think about general intake guidelines for beef cows, and we're thinking about kind of moderate quality forage here. Better quality forage, they'll eat a little bit more. Lower quality forage, they may eat just a tick less. But if we think about a dry cow and mid to really late gestation is what we're talking about most of the time, she's going to eat about 1.8 to 2% of her body weight per day, and that's on a dry matter basis. When we think about that lactating cow, she actually can eat more. She'll eat about 2.3 to 2.5% of her body weight. And there's a couple reasons those lactating cows can eat more. One of them is when cows are consuming forage, especially when we're talking about moderate quality or definitely low quality forage, physical feel, how much can they fill that rumen up, limits how much they'll consume in a day. Now, when we have a big fetus in there, that's pressing up against that rumen, and so the rumen can't expand as much, and so that'll limit intake some. And so that's one reason those lactating cows can eat more. The other thing is there's some metabolic things that go on when those cows are lactating that will also cause them to eat more in those situations. So if we kind of have some ideas of how much that cow is going to eat, we can start to estimate her annual intake of forage and then use that to kind of evaluate some stocking rates. So I told you it's going to vary depending on whether she's dry or lactating and the quality of forage she's consuming. But if we kind of average that out across the year, I would say in most situations, 2.25% of body weight on a dry matter basis is a pretty good average to think about. So just to start here, if we think about a 1,000-pound cow and she's eating 2.25% of her body weight per day, that's about 22.5 pounds of forage times 365 days. She's eating a little over 8,200 pounds of forage. Now, the question is, are we going to let her eat everything that's out there? And absolutely not. Okay, we got to have some left for that stubble height for that plant to regrow. And so when we're dealing with their introduced forages, so things like Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, or Old World blue stems, those kind of forages, we can let those cows consume about 70%, I think is kind of a reasonable guideline there. So if she needs a little over 8,200, but we're only going to let her consume 70% of what's out there, that tells us we need to have at least 11,733 pounds of forage for the year for that cow. Part of that may be hay, part of that may be grazing. We're just going to assume the majority of it's grazing for right now. And so how big of a difference is cow weight going to make? And this is something that's really had a lot of producers end up overstocked without realizing it over the years. As cows have gotten bigger and bigger, what does that mean from a stocking rate standpoint? So just to kind of set this up, I looked at a 1,000-pound cow, 1,200-pound cow, 1,400-pound cow. So how much forage does that cow need for the year? We also have to think about her calf. And I'm going to tell you, we don't have real good numbers on calves, but I went in and made some estimates based on the size of the cow and what that should mean on weaning weight of the calf, and then what that should mean on forage intake for that calf, and then added that together. And so we get a forage intake for the pair. But again, if we're only going to let those cows consume about 70% of what's out there, how much more forage do we need to have in that situation? And so once we get that, then we can think about how much forage are we producing. And this is something, I mean, if you wanted to measure it, you could, but what we're going to do in most situations is just look at some of the available research data and what would be realistic in our environment. And we can use that to help develop an initial stocking rate. And then over time, you can adjust it for your property and for your management. So let's say we're in a situation where we think we're going to grow about 4,500 pounds of forage for that year, and we think about that stocking rate. So 4,500 divided in the need for that 1,000-pound cow and her calf, she would need, that pair would need a little over 3.1 acres per cow-calf pair. Just by going to a 1,200-pound cow, we increase that to 3.7 acres per cow-calf pair. And for a 1,400-pound cow, we increase it to 4.32. So you can see just going from that 1,000-pound cow to that 1,400-pound cow, we need over an acre more land just to adjust for that additional weight. And so one thing that has caused some problems over time is maybe tempting to think about, well, this is how many cows your dad or granddad or somebody in a previous generation ran on that piece of property. but we really need to think about how big were those cows compared to the size of cows we're running now. And I'll tell you, most people will underestimate the weight of the cows. Most cows are weighing more than what you typically estimate. I would tell you this would be, when we're thinking about a starting spot for East and Central Texas, and even some of that South Central Texas area, starting at 4 to 5 acres per cow-calf pair is probably the minimum I would want to start with. I wouldn't want to go any lower than that. It's a whole lot easier to have a little extra grass than it is to be in a situation where you don't have enough grass out there. Now, what if you're dealing in a situation where we're grazing some native range forages? And so things like little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, side oats grama, those kind of things. When we're dealing with those native forages, we cannot consume near as much, okay? We're only going to consume about 25% of the production in that situation. All right. So let's say we're in that West Central Texas area, an hour or so west of I-35 when we're thinking about that Central Texas area. And we're thinking about primarily a little blue stem with maybe a bit of big blue stem in there, that type of scenario. Again, those same 1,000-pound, 1,200-pound, 1,400-pound pairs. We're producing 3,000 pounds of forage in that situation. Since we're only going to let them consume 25%, you can see our stocking rates range from just under 13 acres per cow-calf pair to over 18 acres per cow-calf pair. And that's because with those native forages, again, we just can't consume near as much of what's out there and expect that stand to stay and to produce well over the years. So we have to take into account what forage species we're dealing with as well with those stocking rates. So hopefully that'll kind of give you some things to think about and differences of weight of those cows, and also what are some starting points from a stocking rate standpoint. And again, you're always a whole lot better off to be stocked a little lighter. And everybody always wonders, well, what about making money? And the perception is, well, the more cows I have, the more money you can make. And in reality, what we see in a lot of operations is if they'll cut back on stocking rates a little bit, or number of cows, so they're more conservative on their stocking rate a little bit, we'll actually see those operations make more money. And the reason being is, since they're not stocked as heavy, they're not having to supplement as much when we get into those little short periods of dry weather. So not a severe drought, but just short periods of dry weather. They're not running out of forage. They still have some forage there, so they don't have to go in and supplement extra there or have those cows lose weight. When we're running a few less cows, those cows can be more selective in what they graze, so those body condition scores are better, which typically leads to better pregnancy rates and calf weaning rates. And again, weaning weight of those calves also go up. So in most situations, just realize a lot of times being a little more conservative on the stocking rate can actually make you more money in the long run. I would tell you, I think it's a good idea for a lot of operations is to target only stocking about 80% of what they think the carrying capacity of that operation is. And that'll gives us some flexibility where we get in a year like this, where for some of us, we were getting into some pretty dry conditions up until the last 10 days or so, is we just have some forage buffer there, and we're not always scrambling, or we're not having to feed hay out of season and those kind of things. So kind of taking that conservative approach. It's a whole lot easier if we think about what do we do with that extra forage, rather than, I don't have enough forage, what I have to do. But in this situation, what can I do with that extra forage? Obviously, putting that up as some type of a stored feed stuff. If we can put it up as hay, that's a good option. If you need to put it up as baleage, when we're talking about this time of year and maybe we can't get in there and get it dried for hay, that would be an option. Anytime I can make hay, I would rather make hay than baleage. It's just cheaper in the long run to do that. But if I can't make hay out of it, then baleage would be a consideration. If I have plenty of forage, I could look at skipping a nitrogen application and saving some money there in that situation. So if we're stocked conservatively and we get plenty of rain and we got plenty of forage, just maybe don't fertilize a pasture with nitrogen. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And that's not going to do anything but help our pocketbook in the long run. We could look at, if those cows are in good shape, go ahead and let those calves nurse an extra month or two. And so instead of weaning them at 5 or 6 months, we're weaning them at 7, 8, even 9 months of age and let them put some more weight on. This is a year that if you have the ability to do that with grain prices as high as they are right now and where they're looking like they're going to be and what that's going to mean for cost of gain in the feedlot, for cow-calf producers, the way we can take advantage of those high feed prices is to put more weight on those calves through grass. And instead of selling a 600-pound calf, we go ahead and let them stay on the cow a little bit longer. Then we wean them and we go ahead and graze them as stockers on our operation and then sell them at 750, 800, even 850 pounds. And because of what's going to happen with the price slide where the feedlots aren't going to want to pay as much for those lightweight calves because they don't have to keep them in the feed yard as long and feed them as much. They're going to pay a premium for those bigger calves. And so that's something we can do as cow-calf producers to help ourselves out during times of high grain prices. But to do that, we have to have plenty of forage to do that. If we don't have the forage, that's not going to work. So that would be one way we can use that extra forage. If you do that, make sure you have a preconditioned calf sale. You can sell those calves because if you try to take an 8-weight steer to your local weekly auction and there's not but a handful of them there, you just won't get the value for them. We need to get them in a preconditioned calf sale where there's enough of them that they can get some decent sized groups put together of those calves. So that's kind of thinking about stocking rates and how that's going to vary depending on our soil type, depending on our forage species, and depending on the size of those cows. And again, conservative is always good there. The next thing we're going to talk about is what our hay needs are. And really, before we actually get into the needs, I want to talk about our total pounds. I want to talk about hay storage and what we can do to improve that situation. Then we'll talk about how that affects our needs as well as feeding of that hay. So just to start off, to make sure we're all on the same page, when we look at a round bale of hay, the flat side is what I'm going to refer to as the end of that bale, and the rounded portion we'll refer to as the side of that bale. So when we think about the factors that are going to affect storage loss of that hay, so as we're getting ready to make hay in the next several weeks, hopefully, and we're going to be storing that till this winter, what's going to affect that loss? Well, one is length of storage. The longer we store it, the greater loss potential we have. Soil contact is a big one, and that's where if we can find those sites that drain a little bit better, don't hold as much moisture in the soil, that can really help us there. Weather, is it a dry year, is it a wet year? How much sun are we getting? How much wind are we getting? Wind will, after a rainstorm, will actually help dry those bales back out, and that'll help us. And then humidity always increases our storage losses. Forage species can have some impact. High quality forage, we actually see a little bit more loss in it than we do low quality forage. Not that we want low quality forage, but just to understand how that works. And then bale density and bale size has a pretty good impact. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about bale size, but when we think about density, we want those bales to be pretty tight so they hold their shape and they'll shed that water better. When we look at how soil contact impacts those bales, this was some work done at the University of Wisconsin that looks at moisture content, and they use color gradients. So the more red is lower moisture, and then the blue is higher moisture distribution throughout those bales. And remember, we want to make sure we have 15% or less moisture in that overall bale when we store it, but we can see some fluctuations during the season in those bales. So if we look at the one that's on the ground, you see we have some more moisture down here at the bottom. We all know we're going to lose more of that bale here. If we get it up off the ground, you can see the moisture content stays less, and so we'll see less loss there. Now they use pallets. For those of you who've tried pallets before, some of you don't mind them. A lot of folks aren't a real big fan of them. I guess I would probably fall in the group of not being a big fan of them, because obviously you have to worry about nails and then you're always having to move them. In that situation, I would rather just find me a place that has some slope on it and some soil that drains really well, and probably just put those bales there rather than hassling with those pallets. But you can prevent a little bit of that ground loss if you use some pallets in that situation. Question usually comes up about net wrap versus twine wrap. So again, looking at the moisture content there, I'm going to tell you it's not that one's better than the other. It's really going to depend on how much twine you put on those bales as far as how it's going to compare to the net wrap. But you can see if those bales are wrapped well and hold their shape better, they shed that water. And so we see overall a much drier bale in that situation. We could do the same thing with the twine wrap bale if we wrapped it with more twine. So again, depending on how you go about baling those bales. I mentioned forage species is going to have an impact on storage losses. If we look at something with a big stem or stalk, we just can't get those as tight. And so we will see more moisture getting into that bale, and we'll see a little bit more loss there than we will with something with a finer stem that we can get a little tighter, and we just don't have as much opening. I've already mentioned that density and the importance of having those bales wrapped tight to shed that water better and just help prevent water from soaking into those bales. This is a really interesting graphic to show you the difference in size of bales and how that can impact our losses. And so what they did in this, when making these calculations, is look at if we had a loss going 2 inches deep, 4 inches deep, 6 inches deep, what percentage of the total bale does that represent? So looking at a bale that's 4 inches or 4 foot in height or diameter versus a 6 foot. And if we look at the 4 foot, the outer 2 inches would represent 16% of the total. The outer 2 inches of the bigger bale only represents 11% of the total. And so the bigger we can make that bale, the better off we're going to be, because that part we lose around the edge is going to represent a smaller portion of the total bale when we're talking about those larger bales. If we looked at 6 inches deep on that 4 foot tall bale, we're talking about 44% of the volume of the bales represented in those outer 6 inches, compared to that 6 foot tall bale, only 31%. So the taller we can make those bales, generally the better off we're going to be from a storage standpoint if we're stacking those bales outside. Kind of give you some ranges, and you can see there's some pretty big ranges here, and that's what we see because of all the variable factors we have there. Stored under a roof, expect losses anywhere from about 2 to 10% on weight going in versus weight coming out, and storage loss there. If we look at a rock pad, so some people actually put a rock pad down or doing something to elevate those bales and then covering them outside, 2 to 17% loss. Rock pad or elevated but uncovered, 3 to 46% loss. So really depending on how much rain we get and how tightly those bales are rolled. If we look at storing it on the ground, covered versus uncovered, you can see those ranges there. Just because we have it on the ground doesn't mean we're going to lose a lot. It really depends on where we put it and those other factors as well. The reason we see so much variation is one is where those studies done and what's the annual rainfall. If we had a situation where we could do everything identical with those bales and the soil type and those kind of things, but if we just look at deep southeast Texas where we're over 55 inches of annual rainfall a year, that's going to have a big difference compared to when we get into this 26 to 30 inch rainfall belt. So how much rain we're dealing with can have a pretty significant impact there. This is some work done out of Louisiana at LSU there. So they looked at round bales stored for about 280 days. In a pole barn, they saw about 2.6% loss, tarps about 8.8, and just outside about a 15% loss in that situation. Question often comes up, and I'll leave the details for another presentation another time. If you're interested, just let your county agents know and we can get it on the schedule to really talk about barns and some considerations there more in depth. But I'll tell you, when you're looking at storing hay from a cow-calf standpoint, we're looking at storing round bales. I'd probably figure on taking at least 10 to 15 years to pay for that hay barn. I've heard people talk about paying for it in 2 or 3 years, and I just can't find the math to do that. Now, if I'm selling little square bales to horses, absolutely, but not feeding round bales in a cow-calf operation. Tarps sound real good. I've kind of come to the conclusion that most people who really recommend tarps haven't really tried them too much. I've tried tarps in a lot of different fashions, and needless to say, we don't mess with tarps anymore. So if you find something that's working for you, great. But you look at the cost and the length of time those things last and how big of a challenge they can be to deal with, especially if you're in an area with a little more wind. They may not work as well as what you would hope. So what can we do to help prevent those storage losses? Minimize that soil contact is really good. Rock pads. I've seen people take old telephone posts, put them side by side, set the bale on top of them. That's an option. You will see some skunks and possums and coons tend to get under there, so just be aware of that. I haven't tried it, but I think you could probably, if you took a strip of plastic, some 2 mil plastic that you could buy really cheap, and put it in a strip somewhere about 18 to 24 inches wide underneath those bales, just preventing that ground contact there. I actually think that would work pretty well and be pretty easy and pretty low cost in that situation. So that's something to try if you wanted to. We've already talked about the pros and cons of pallets. Tires have some of the same pros and cons. You don't have to worry about getting a nail and a tractor tire in that situation when you're using old tires, but you are constantly having to move them. You do have the big downside of they're going to get water in them, and when you don't have bales on top of them, mosquitoes come up. Problem if you put bales on top of them and there's still water in them, there's obviously water there that's going to keep the humidity up on the lower portion of that. And then just dealing with the disposal of those tires if you ever decide you don't want them. So may seem like a good idea, but really think through that before you go down that route. Preventing weather exposure, so barns, tarps, plastic sheeting. We've already talked about the challenges with the tarps and the plastic sheeting. What we can really do that's easy, that all of us can do, is make sure we store that hay in sunny locations with a good breeze. We don't want to be storing it under trees or in low-lying areas or areas with poor drainage. If you can stack them north to south, that helps, but that's not a huge deal. Sunny location with a good breeze is important. And then make sure we're always stacking those bales end to end in a long, narrow row. That helps tremendously, and keep plenty of distance between them. I like to keep at least 3 foot between them. The more distance we can keep between them, when those bales get wet, we can get more air and more sunlight in there and dry them back out quicker. And so we'll see less loss in that situation. Here are things you want to avoid. Under trees is not good, and then definitely too close together here. That's just not going to be very successful. We're going to see quite a bit more loss in that situation. And we even see a lot of times under those types of situations, we'll keep enough moisture in that bale, especially on rye grass that we're getting ready to cut this time of year. That stuff will actually start sprouting when it's in storage. And so going to have a fair bit of loss there in those situations. And then never want to be storing square bales, whether they're little or big, outside without some kind of cover on them in those situations. So then that kind of leads us into hay feeding and what kind of losses can we experience there. And so how's that going to affect how much hay we ultimately need? When we look at feeding losses, legitimately, they can range from 2 to 60%, depending on how you go about doing it. I would tell you, we definitely want to try moving those feeding locations around if we can. That helps prevent buildup of mud. It also helps spread manure out in those situations. If you're going to unroll hay, and I'm a huge proponent of unrolling hay, if we're just trying to feed it, we only want to unroll enough for 1 day's worth. Otherwise, it'll turn into bedding and we'll waste some. Now, this year, when we had that huge winter storm, that was the perfect time to be unrolling extra hay and giving those cows a place to bed, especially having some calves out there that really help those cows come through the winter in better shape in those situations. So there are times we want to unroll more hay than they can eat from a bedding standpoint. But if we're just unrolling it from a feeding standpoint, just make sure they're cleaning it up every day before you feed more the next day. Well, that doesn't mean you have to unroll hay every day. If you have multiple pastures, you can unroll today's and this pasture unroll tomorrow's, and another pasture unroll the day after that, another pasture, and then just go open gates to let them in those pastures. Or I've even seen people do it. They'll make little feeding areas with electric fence. So they could get out there just once or twice a week and put out hay, and then the rest of the time they just have to go open electric fence gate or open a traditional gate. So it doesn't mean you have to actually unroll it every day, but we need to provide access to new hay on a daily basis. A lot of people like using rings. We'll talk about pros and cons and what kind of variation and waste we see and some cost considerations. The one on the top left here is what they call a cone feeder. So just think about a regular feeder with a skirt around the bottom of it, but then it has a cone insert in the top of it that you set the bell in. Definitely, if we're looking at using a hay feeder, that's going to be the least amount of feeding waste we see. This is some work done by Dan Buskirk up at Michigan State, where they saw about 3.5% waste there. While this is the lowest waste, it's definitely the most expensive feeder in that situation. If we look at a more traditional with just a skirt around it, they were seeing about 6.1% loss in that situation. So a question came in, would unrolling hay make cattle susceptible to more ground-borne pathogens? I'm not aware of any situation that would really show that would make those cattle more susceptible to pathogens there. It's really not going to be much different from them grazing those pastures in that situation. And in some farms, I could actually see it potentially reducing pathogen load because you're unrolling in a different place and really spreading it out much more and spreading those animals out compared to what we would if we were just using rings. And we do not need to have the ground frozen to unroll hay. I'll tell you, that's all we do is unroll hay. The only time I use a ring anymore is if we have some bulls up, by themselves during the winter, so we wouldn't be unrolling very much, or have a cow in a dry lot or something like that. Otherwise, we're unrolling hay the rest of the time. And like I said, I really prefer that over using rings. And I think in the long run, it's actually much cheaper than that to do that. I do want to mention real quick while we're talking about these different rings here, is you got to pay attention if you're going to buy one with a skirt on the bottom of it, is make sure they really changed the way they've made these over the last 20 years or so. Is they've started not, depending on the brand, so look at them, they're starting to not have as much of that skirt up on the metal. So a lot of times we're not getting a good weld there, and those skirts are coming off much sooner than what they did at one point in time. So do pay attention to that. Trailers always come up as a question, but you can actually see in this study they saw more hay loss in the trailer than they did with either of the two previous rings. So they were looking at about 11.4% here. And then this cradle system, that's actually where they saw their greatest loss. And obviously both of these would be more expensive than those rings. Just talking about some pros and cons of some of the various rings we see out there. So these would represent some of the more common ones. So this top one and then this one here on the right, this is a very common design out there, one of the lower cost varieties. The only difference here is this is a steel one and this is a one made out of plastic there that you don't have to worry about it rusting. So it does cost a little bit more there, but that does provide some restriction and help. The more restriction we can have, the better. So on this one, the top's a little better because the cow has to put her head in there. They won't drag as much hay out as they would on these other two versions, but we're definitely more open around the bottom, which isn't real desirable in that situation. When we kind of look at weighing out that balance of cost as well as doing a better job of restricting, these two styles tend to kind of fit that bill for a lot of people out there. So we're slanted at the top, so that helps provide good restriction there. We do have more restriction on the bottom, but yet it's open, so we get a little bit more airflow than what we do with some of the full skirted ones, which can be better, especially if it's taken a little while for those cows to eat that hay down there. And then these may hold up a little bit better on the bottom than what some of the skirts do. And I'll tell you, back before we went to straight unrolling, I've used both this style with the skirt and these styles both. And I'll tell you, I didn't notice much difference between loss with them. And these styles actually held up a little bit better than what that skirt did there. And then this is just another version of that comb feeder. So just think of a skirted feeder with that insert in there. But a lot of times you may be looking at in excess of $1,000 to $1,200 for one of these comb ones. And so when you work through that math, yes, you have the least amount of waste, but how many years do you have that to own that to pay for that difference there? And will that feeder last long enough? You'll just have to sit down and do that math, but it may not work out the way you would expect. So do be aware of that. I've already mentioned I'm a huge proponent of unrolling hay. There's a lot of benefits, I think, there. One way you can do it is with the 3-point attachment like this. Depending on what you buy, you're looking at anywhere from $1,500 to a few $1,000s, but you can buy a good one for not as much. I mean, steel prices have gone up, so that has really hurt us. But before steel prices went up, you could buy a really good one for about $1,500 there. And the way they're designed is they just work off of hydraulics and open up. And then it just has a little spinner here. And when you set that on the ground, you can roll it out and then it'll roll that hay out, and then you can pick it up and only feed half that bale and wait and feed the rest of it another day, or move it to a different location or a different pasture. So it gives you some flexibility there. When we look at unrolling versus rings, some other things to think about, we do see some ear tag loss due to feeding in hay rings. Just those cattle go in and out of those rings will rub a few more ear tags off. We do tend to see a few more stable fly problems if we don't go in there and treat those areas where we have those rings. Whereas if we're unrolling them and we don't have that same amount of waste there, we just don't see as much stable fly issues in those situations. To unroll that hay, I've already talked about that 3-point attachment, which was one of the more common. You can unroll with just your front end loader. If you got spears on the front, just bend them back and you can put them up against that bale and unroll them. It's not perfect, but it'll work pretty well. You can also do that with the front tire on the tractor. And then I've even seen people roll them off the side of the hill. When I was in grad school at Oklahoma State, that's what we would do there, is just roll them, put them on the side of the hill and just manually push them and get them rolling down that hill. Now, I will tell you it's important when you're unrolling bales, you got to pay attention to which way it's wrapped and make sure you go the right direction, and you'll figure that out pretty quick. Where I kind of wanted to end up here is talking a little bit about bale size, and then we'll get into how much do you need, but pose the question and just answer this mentally to yourself, and then we'll look at it. Which is going to be bigger, a 4x6 bale or a 5x5? And again, when I go 4x6, we're always going to talk width first, and then diameter or height is going to be second. So if we look at that, and I looked at the volume of these various size bales, all at the same density of the same forage, what would we expect those bales to weigh? So if we use a 5x5 bale that's weighing 1,100 pounds as our base, what would those other bales weigh? Well, 4x6 is actually going to be bigger. There's more volume there. And so you're looking at 1,267 pounds versus 1,100 pounds in this situation. A 5x6, almost 1,600 pounds. A 4x5, you're less than 900 pounds there. So size does make quite a bit of difference. If we look at from a percentage standpoint, the difference in those bales, if we just set that 5x5 as kind of our base, the 4.6 or the 4x6 would be 15% bigger. The 4x5 would be 20% smaller. The 5x6 would be 44% bigger in that situation. So then how much hay do we need? Now that's going to depend or vary depending on the size of the cow. You've already seen that from a stocking rate standpoint. Same thing from a hay standpoint. Length of your hay feeding period. Are you feeding dry cows? Are you feeding lactating cows? What are your storage and feeding losses? And then are you feeding that hay free choice? Or do you have some really good hay and you can limit feed it some? All right. And so what I'm going to do real quick is get out a PowerPoint here and see if I can't get my Excel file pulled up, and we'll actually work through that. And that was that Excel file I was talking about earlier that you can find at the beef.tamu.edu website under spreadsheets. Okay, and so this is the annual cow cost file. There's a directions tab, an annual cost or annual cow cost, and then estimating cost. So this estimating cost tab is going to be the one I'm on. So the way this is set up, and notice I haven't talked about how many bales do you need per cow, because we know there's difference in bales. So what we really want to talk about is how many pounds do we need for those cows. So you can go in here and customize this to your operation. Any place you see blue font, that's for you to enter your own value. Any place you see black font is locked down, so it won't change those formulas. So the first thing is, how big of a cow are we going to use? So I'm just going to go ahead and put a 1,300 pound cow in here. And let's say she's lactating. So remember when I was talking about lactating cows, 2.3 to 2.5% of their body weight. And let's just say they're only going to be lactating for part of the winter. So that's why I put the 2.4 in there. So that would tell me hay per day that cow needs on a dry matter basis, or what she would consume, is a little over 31 pounds. What's the dry matter content of that hay? So how much moisture do we have in it? When we look at hay that's just stored outside in most parts of Texas, we're going to look at that hay running somewhere about 88 to about 90% dry matter. So I have 90, we'll put 88 in here just so you can see how that changes. And each time I change a value, it's changing the other ones for me. So now I know on an as-fed basis, how much hay is that cow potentially going to need per day, but I haven't accounted for storage losses or feeding losses yet. So what are our storage losses going to be? And let's just say it's been a year where we've got some more rain. Maybe the hay wasn't wrapped as tight. Maybe we didn't have it in the best place. So let's figure a 15% storage loss there right now. But let's say we did a little better job from a feeding standpoint. We only lost 5% on feeding. Now that tells me how many pounds a day would I have needed to start with to have this, how much that cow could potentially consume a day. So now I've adjusted for storage and feeding losses, and I went from 35 pounds to almost 44 pounds a day I need. Now I can put the number of days in there I'm feeding hay. So let's say we have a really good forage system and we have Bermuda grass, our stockpile of Bermuda grass. We have our cool season annual forages, and we're only feeding hay for 45 days during the winter. In that situation, we would only need to start out with about 2,000 pounds of hay per cow. But let's say we don't have that winter pasture, we don't have that stockpile of forage, and now we're feeding potentially 5 months. All right, so you're feeding November, December, January, February, March, maybe even to April a little bit there. You could be looking at 6,500 pounds of forage. What I would tell most people is 100 days is probably a pretty good place to start if you're not real sure. And in that situation, you're looking at about 4,300, 4,400 pounds of forage. If you're using an 1,100 pound roll, that'd be 4 rolls per cow-calf pair I would need. But again, make sure we pay attention to how big those bales are and just what our needs are. And you can see that change drastically. So hopefully this tool can help you use that and come up with some better estimates for your operation. When we look at hay cost, you can put that in, put in your bale weight. It'll calculate a cost per ton for you. And then if you wanted to look at the number of bales with that given weight, it goes ahead and puts that in there for you. And now it even will calculate you a hay cost per day and a hay cost per cow per year. Now that doesn't take into account if the hay's not good enough quality and you have to add some supplement, what that additional supplement cost would be, but just strictly your hay cost. So hopefully that's something you can use and give you some better estimates. If you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask those. And that's where I was planning on wrapping up tonight. So again, any questions, feel free to put those in the chat box or go ahead and unmute and ask those questions. So the question was, can this do a cost benefit analysis of planning a cool season annual? So this isn't really set up to do that. I mean, you can look at your hay cost, but the easier way to do that is to figure out what your seed cost is, what your planting cost is, what your fertilizer cost is, and what your yield is, and figure out then this is my yield, this is what it costs, so this is what it costs me per ton. And then you could compare the cost of your cool season annual to your hay. I will tell you, it will almost always price out better with that cool season annual. And just to give you some estimates on cost, and I run these costs pretty regularly every fall to see where we're at. But if we look at ryegrass, and so I'm just looking at straight ryegrass overseeded, and I'm going to use ryegrass rather than small grain rye or wheat. One, because ryegrass is easier to plant, seed cost is going to be cheaper, and it's going to have a higher yield potential. The other thing is when we look at the growth time, the small grains used to have an advantage of a little bit more earlier growth, but really with the new varieties of ryegrass, we just don't see that advantage much anymore. So ryegrass is definitely the go-to in a lot of situations. If we look at planting 25 pounds per acre of ryegrass, we look at somewhere between 180 and 200 pounds of nitrogen at 50 cents a pound nitrogen cost. So what we've been paying for the last several years, not necessarily what we may have to pay this coming fall. And then we look at a 6,000 to 8,000 pound yield goal there. With the ryegrass, we're looking at a cost per ton of dry matter produced somewhere between about $20 and $50 a ton, which will be cheaper than most hay, will be almost always cheaper than hay. But the big thing is that ryegrass is going to be much higher quality than what our hay is going to be. And we know we're not going to have to supplement when we're grazing that ryegrass. So I'm always a big proponent of at least planting some ryegrass. If you want to plant some other cool season annuals, that's something to consider. I know a lot of times you hear you can't afford to graze that cool season annual full time. If we're in a situation where we had some really cheap native range, then that would be the case. But in our environment, when we're feeding hay, we can actually graze that ryegrass cheaper. The one thing we need to remember there is pairs, graze it full time. If we're talking cows in late gestation, we need to limit graze it and then feed some hay. I will tell you, Dr. Olson and I, every year in August, do a day-long program where we talk about the use of stockpile forage and the use of cool season annuals. And with the cool season annuals, we'll go through species, we'll go through what soil types they work better in, we'll go through varieties, we'll talk about how to plant them, we'll talk about cost of those, we'll talk about grazing utilization and mineral supplements and those kind of things. Comment came into the chat box, and I'll just summarize it, that they were unrolling hay and kind of doing that across the field. And one thing they were really surprised about was how much better the grass looked the next year and how much less damage they had to the topsoil. And I took the picture out of my slide set tonight, but normally I'll use some pictures, either an actual picture taken or satellite images. Another reason I like unrolling hay is we won't damage that soil like we will when we're feeding rings. You can actually see where we fed hay with the ring from a satellite image. And in that area right around that ring, we typically see reduced forage growth for at least that following year and sometimes longer. Okay, so just to repeat, anytime we're grazing a cool season annual, so ryegrass, small grain rye, wheat, oats, ryegrass, because that forage is so high in protein and so high in energy, I don't want to take a female, whether it's a cow or a heifer, and graze her full time in late gestation. If I do, I can potentially increase the birth weight of that calf, and depending on how much I increase it, maybe create some calving problems. So females in late gestation, we only want to limit graze and then have them grazing or consuming hay the rest of the time. And when I talk about limit grazing, we're talking about roughly 2 hours a day in that situation. Pairs, on the other hand, we don't have to worry about that. So if we have enough forage available, I can graze those pairs full time on that cool season annual. So hopefully that answers your question on repeating that. If not, just type it back in and we can visit about that in some more detail. All right, good deal. Glad that answered that question for you. Any other questions? All right, well, that looks like that's all the questions for tonight. So we'll go ahead and wrap up there, and everybody have a good evening, and hopefully you don't get any severe damage from the weather and you get the rain that you need.